My name is Rael Cahn. I am happy to be presenting today with Alan Weiss, and we're speaking on the topic of looking inward, the practice and science of mindfulness. So this is actually our first time doing this presentation, where we're really doing, our effort is to both present the practical instruction and experience of mindfulness meditation and its different varieties, in addition to a number of scientific forays in between sessions into what's happening in the brain and what we know from the now many years of research investigating the psychological and neurophysiological, brain correlates to how the brain is being changed through these kinds of practices. So just a note that both Alan and I are among the leadership of the USC Center for Mindfulness Science, and Alan is also the director of Mindful USC, which, as some of you may know, provides mindfulness trainings for faculty, staff, and students at USC in a complementary basis with support from the USC provost over these last 6 years. So without further ado, we're going to be speaking about mindfulness. And one of the first things, of course, that really becomes important to at least discuss briefly is what do we mean when we say mindfulness? And in the psychological literature, it's become quite an important new distinction over the last 20 years, this concept of mindfulness. These are just listed here are just 9 of the current 13 published scales attempting to quantify what are we talking about when we are saying mindfulness. And of course, it's a term that actually comes from old traditions, contemplative traditions. Probably one of the most kind of systematic and formulaic is the Buddhist tradition, but other contemplative traditions had this concept within them as well. And I'm pointing here in this slide, in addition to these different names of mindfulness scales, a particular scale, the 5-factor mindfulness questionnaire, which uses these kind of 4 different components as defining mindfulness. This capacity for acting with awareness and for being non-reactive and non-judgmental, as well as for observing, being aware and observing of our emotions. And so this kind of confluence of activities within that particular scale defines mindfulness. However, that's just one conception. And to go into a little bit more detail about it in some of the research, the Freiburg Mindfulness Inventory is one of the early mindfulness scales, developed from talking to people who practiced a lot of years of mindfulness meditation and trying to understand, what was different after engaging in these practices. And the 4 factors identified there are mindful presence, for example, noticing when you have an absence of mind and being able to gently return to the experience of here and now. A non-judgmental acceptance, an experience of moments of inner peace and ease, even when things are hectic and stressful. The tendency towards openness to experience, feeling connected to your experience in the here and now instead of kind of distant and checked out. And insight, the capacity to kind of see things with perspective of it. I'm able to smile when I notice how I sometimes make life difficult. So those are just example questions on this particular scale, the Freiburg Mindfulness Inventory. Another one is the one I mentioned, the 5-factor mindfulness questionnaire, where they have these 5 different components that have been identified. And this is really one of the most commonly used questionnaires to measure by self-report people's tendencies towards mindfulness. So non-reactivity refers to the capacity to watch one's feelings without getting lost in them. Non-judgmentality, example would be that you tell yourself you shouldn't be thinking the way that you are. That would be being kind of judgmental about your experience as opposed to non-judgmental, which would be the opposite of that. the tendency to act with awareness. I don't pay attention to what I'm doing because I'm daydreaming, worrying, otherwise distracted. This is the opposite of being aware of what one's doing in the midst of action. Observing, I pay attention to sensations such as the wind in my hair, sun on my face, is a component of observing moment-to-moment experience. And then describing, I can usually describe how I feel in the moment in considerable detail. So these 5 different components are considered to contribute to this construct of mindfulness within that scale. More and more, the scales are starting to include what in the investigation of mindfulness within the psychological literature, where we see very clearly that even though these definitions are somewhat different, they do tend to correlate with each other, and people who are more mindful tend to be more resilient, less tending towards depression and anxiety. And if you can help people become more mindful, much clinical literature now suggests you can help people become less anxious and less depressed. And as the study of mindfulness has grown, a key component of mindfulness seems to be something about self-compassion and self-kindness. So within this self-compassion scale that's been recently developed, there's actually a hidden kind of definition of mindfulness as one of the 3 components of self-compassion. Self-compassion being self-kindness versus self-judgment as one component, the experience of being part of a common humanity versus being a kind of isolated self, and then the tendency towards being mindful and not identified with current conditions and being over-identified. So when I'm feeling down, I try to approach my feelings with curiosity and openness as a kind of mindful approach, whereas an over-identified approach, when something painful happens, I tend to blow the incident out of proportion. So this is just a kind of quick survey of some of the attempts of modern psychological investigation to understand and define mindfulness. And I'm going to turn this over to Alan now, but just briefly, it's actually important to point to the fact that this term did come from Buddhist tradition. And in the Buddhist and pre-Buddhist Pali and Sanskrit languages, the word that's now called mindfulness actually was defined as to remember or to recollect, which is somewhat different from this kind of bare attention that is oftentimes focused on within the Western psychological construct. And so to remember what, in general, although there's really debate within the Buddhist traditions about exactly what is being remembered, it's something about the relative value of things. For example, the 3 marks of existence, the teaching within Buddhism that one can realize through practice, it is said, are that the truth of existence is that everything is impermanent, everything is selfless, the experience of self is somehow constructed and not fundamentally real and substantial, and that there's this underlying kind of unsatisfactoriness that's present. So in conclusion, with regards to the traditional Buddhist conceptions, different schools of Buddhist thought had this kind of common recollect something about the nature of things. And then that kind of turned into these other definitions that are related, like this active, watchful mind or the bare attention and others. So just a few words from the focus within the psychological attempts to define this concept. And I'm turning it over now to Alan. Thank you so much.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Rael. Okay, so my name is Alan, and as Rael said, I'm the director of Mindful USC. So we're going to try a little practice here. And the first one is going to be just a simple breath meditation. Just so I can get my own definition here, is just to pay attention and just relax your mind. You know, don't have to react or anything like that. You'll see that it's not that easy to do. So all I'd like you to do is just, you can close your eyes or you can leave your eyes a little bit open, but it's easier to do if you close your eyes because we're going to be paying attention to what's going on inside of us. Take a couple of deep breaths. Is the easiest way to start, just to kind of connect with your breath. And you might also scan your body just to see if you're holding any tension right now in your body. We often carry tension in our face and our neck and our shoulders, our upper and lower arms and our hands all the way down through our torso. And then when you're ready, just bring your attention to your breath, wherever you feel it most vividly. Maybe it's at the belly as it expands and contracts, or maybe just as air that passes in and out of your nose. And just keep your attention on the breath. See if you can just stick with it all the way in and all the way out. You might notice how it feels. If the breath isn't comfortable, you can actually adjust it. You can make it longer or shorter, deeper or shallower. You can make it faster or slower, just allowing the breath to calm down to a rate that feels just right for you. Now, when you've adjusted the breath to feel most comfortable, then just simply ride the in and out breath, just like a raft would arise and fall at the seashore. Just letting each breath remind you over and over again to be fully present. And when you notice your attention has wandered off the breath, which it will do, just notice where it's gone and then gently just bring it back to the breath, and do this over and over again each time this happens. Just staying fully in touch with the breath, just this breath going in, just this breath going out. And again, your attention will wander away. It does this for every person who's ever done this, so don't worry about that. You can even label wherever it's gone to. Say, oh, this is thinking. This is thinking. Or maybe this is sadness, if it's an emotion. Just reminding yourself from time to time that you're not trying to get anywhere. You're not trying to feel anything special. You're just simply allowing yourself to be where you are right now, observing and accepting whatever is here. So then just take a couple of deep breaths to end this meditation. And I'll play a bell so that you can use this to just gently open your eyes. And so we're humans, as just humans who react as we come into contact with the world through our senses. And whatever we meet feels unpleasant, we react with attraction. If we feel it's pleasant, or if it feels unpleasant, we react with aversion. And to these reactions, we could add guilt and self-doubt, anxiety, paranoia, wishful thinking, and so on. These reactions are entirely natural, and we have no control over them. They're simply what happens when an organism interacts with its environment. And so what mindfulness is doing is really stopping you from not having the first reaction. It's actually stopping you from having the reaction afterwards. As Viktor Frankl says, between stimulus and response, there's a space. And the stimulus I'm referring to is actually this thing that arises. And so with that, the last meditation I did was just a standard breath meditation. I want to show you another meditation that is allied with this, that allows you to maybe get a little bit more concentration, because a lot of people who come to meditation, that's really what they want, is concentration. And so to do this, again, all I want you to do is close your eyes, but now remember that your attention will wander away. And when it does, it's this first reaction. It's this pleasant or unpleasant, and the thinking that arises, etc. As I always tell my students, you never ask to be anxious. You never ask to have any of these emotions. They just arise. Okay, so with that, just close your eyes once again. And this time what we're going to do is we're going to just focus our attention just on the area at the entrance of the nostrils. That's the area at the entrance of the nostrils. And just see if you can become aware of every breath going in and every breath going out. It could be a natural breath, normal breath, whatever it is. If it's long, it's long. If it's short, it's short. It's passing through the left nostril, passing through the right nostril, or through both nostrils. Just remain aware of just the breath at the entrance of the nostrils. Alert, attentive, and vigilant. Just remain alert, attentive, and vigilant to the breath as it goes in and out of the nostrils. Constantly aware of the breath, the incoming and outgoing breath, incoming and outgoing breath. steadfastly fixed on the entrance of the nostrils, just like a gatekeeper, like a watchman, just aware of every breath entering the nostrils and moving out of the nostrils. Just being alert, attentive, and vigilant. Incoming breath, outgoing breath, natural breath, pure breath. Nothing but just breathing in and breathing out. And then for the last 30 seconds, just stay aware of the breath, the incoming and outgoing breath, just like a gatekeeper, just aware every breath entering the nostrils and moving out of the nostrils. And then now just take a couple of deep breaths. And gently open your eyes. All right, I'll turn this over to Rael. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anne. So I'm going to speak a little bit about that aspect of the focusing of attention that these initial practices Alan just led us through highlight. And just a quick kind of schema for a particular model of mindfulness, showing the centrality of pretty much any model for kind of understanding from a psychological process perspective. These kinds of practices are going to have attention really kind of central. And it's the way that we are attending to moment experience that we have some control over and that we really utilize as the kind of lever for engaging in this practice. The thing that we change is how we are attending. And so, of course, when you think of the mindfulness practice in whole, there are these motivational factors that are really important and probably don't get enough study. Attitudes, expectations, what do we want from the practice, our intentions. We engage in the practice, which involves really honing our attention on our inner experience, which of course interfaces with the external world in a particular way, both kind of capitalizing our capacity for cognitive flexibility and emotional flexibility, and kind of trained through the capacity for non-judging awareness, being receptive to the moment-to-moment experience, not trying to make it something else or have some thoughts to compensate for what we don't like or any of that, just noticing those tendencies to occur as they do. And then from that seems to come, now we have good evidence, both increases in mental well-being and physical well-being and changes in the way we act in the world, giving us more capacity to act with flexibility and autonomously, not so automatic. And this kind of central role of attention and the capacity to control where we place our attention is mediated through a particular network, the so-called central executive network or frontal parietal attention network of the brain. And it's highlighted here by this study from Wendy Hesenkamp and colleagues from 2012, which utilized the self-report measure of when you notice your mind has wandered as a way of getting at what are the brain areas that seem to be activated in the process when the mind is wandering compared to those moments when you notice it's wandering and kind of bring it back to the, in this case, the awareness of the breath moment to moment that we were just doing. And then fractionating the relative brain activity from kind of significantly before to just after one presses the button. Oh, I've just my mind coming back. You notice that there's the focused absorption on the breath, which engages this frontal attentional network, as we're kind of focusing our attention successfully. And then what tends to happen is the mind wanders. We kind of go to something else besides our intended focus, and that engages the default mode. And we'll speak about these different brain areas as we go through this scientific part of the presentation. And then becoming aware of that, it turns out that there's a set of brain areas called the salience network that is related also to body awareness that seems to light up as we become aware that we're doing something a little different from what we had intended. Getting into a lot of things. Then shifting back involves, again, this kind of central executive network, cognitive control network. So both the shifting back and the maintaining of focus really require this cognitive control network. And this is another way of looking at that the kind of cycle of staying engaged with the activity of the breath, the sensation of the breath, getting distracted and mind wandering, noticing that we've mind wandered and disengaging from that and shifting back to engage breath. It goes in a circle as you engage in practice. And in a way, this kind of highlights the fact that this is very much like a exercise for the brain, certainly an exercise for the mind, and you're exercising these key aspects of the circuits that underlie important functions of the brain, exercising it without the benefit of having some compelling content like a video game or learning a new language or math, some kind of learning. Instead, you're really just working with moment-to-moment experience without focusing on content as a way of kind of fine-tuning the capacity to regulate the brain circuits. And we see here that these executive and orienting networks that I'm referring to as the central executive network are really key. They're kind of part of this capacity to focus and bring attention back whenever the mind wanders. And so some studies that have focused on those kinds of networks as they're changed through meditation. I'm going to highlight a few of them here. One is this study by Norm Farb and colleagues back in 2007. Was one of the first studies to really start getting at the brain circuits that were changing in relationship to practice, looking at the activity of the brain when participants went through being in a scanner with words being shown that were adjectives, and the task was either to just let the words kind of create whatever sensory impression they do, but don't kind of fixate on them or try to make a lot of meaning out of them, versus judging, does that apply to me or not? Is that word, is that adjective true of me, or is it not true of me? Kind of an experiential focus versus a narrative focus on these words that are presented. And it turns out that if you engage in those words with more of a narrative focus, thinking about, are they related to me? Do they describe me? You engage this network of brain areas called the default mode that also gets engaged when mind wandering, I just mentioned in that previous slide. And so that mind wandering default mode, kind of engaging in the narrative processing, seems to be a really key aspect of how the brain supports kind of abstract thinking capacities. And if you look at people who've gone through a mindfulness training, an 8-week mindfulness course versus people who haven't, which is what they made this comparison to this study, they showed that for the folks who've gone through an 8-week course, there are some significant differences in the degree to which the default mode was activated, as well as some of the other networks related to attention. So the folks who've gone through the training deactivate their default mode. Here on the right, in this dark blues, the trained meditators kind of column. They deactivate that default mode to a greater extent than novices before you've learned these practices and engage. And in addition, while they're deactivating that default mode network to a greater extent, they're also engaging the attention cognitive control network, this network that's showing up in yellow and red, as well as a network related to experiencing the feeling in the body. So this kind of highlights the impact on attentional control that is enhanced through these kinds of practices. In addition, a number of studies have now shown that if you look at the impact of these practices on attentional performance, you do get really significant improvement. So for example, this was a difficult auditory task, 2 different tones being presented, a so-called auditory oddball task, and the tones were very similar, so it's hard to distinguish whether it was the target or the standard that was being presented at the moment. And practitioners looking before and after a 3-month intensive retreat showed an improvement in their sensitivity, their capacities to recognize these subtle differences in auditory cues, and in addition, a decrease in their reaction time, so more quick responding, and in association with that, an increase in the brain response to the stimuli that is the encoding of the stimuli that the brain is doing, represented in that red picture there. A similar kind of study I conducted, where I looked at this auditory oddball paradigm while people were asked to stay in the meditation state versus to stay in the thinking mind-wandering state. And so looking at meditators when thinking versus mind-wandering, and told to just ignore the stimuli to see whether the brain also shows the capacity for disregarding distraction to a greater extent. And what I found there is that the first stimulus impression in the first 100 milliseconds or so, which is represented in these intensity of the blue, in the meditation state tended to be greater than in the mind-wandering state. The early sensory impression is greater, but in the meditation state, the later distraction related to frontal brain engagement, the 300, 400 millisecond time range, after that sensory impression, the brain either responds with a kind of responsive, oh, what happened out there, or just stays in a restful state, and that was decreased. So this effect of the concentration aspect of meditation seems to be that the brain shows less evidence for distraction. And a kind of set of studies by Yi-Wan Tang and colleagues over the 2007 to 2011 time range showed these effects both on attention and improved performance on a attention monitoring kind of paradigm after a relatively brief introduction to mindfulness meditation practice of a couple of weeks. In combination with that, they found improvements in the response of salivary immune markers, the immunoglobulins in your saliva that are produced in order to ward off viruses and that kind of thing. So they found some increases in the meditation group of the production of those kinds of immune defense mechanism in combination with a decrease in the amount of cortisol indexing stress, how stress is propelled. And then of key importance to this discussion of the kind of attentional control modules of the brain, they found this impact in the front midline area, the cingulate cortex, which is shown even better here, that after this introduction to mindfulness meditation, there's increases in the structural integrity of these brain areas. But not just functional enhancements, but some evidence also for changes in the microstructure of the way the brain is actually formed. So related to this concentrative aspect, we see a number of lines of evidence showing enhanced capacity for flexible brain engagement and attentional performance, as well as stimulus encoding combined with decreases in tendency of the brain measures of distraction. And overall, this enhanced activation of cognitive control through the brain areas. So, turning it back over to.
All right, so now what I want to do is to show you something about how we use our emotions. So I want you to start by closing your eyes again, and we're going to start with mindfulness of the breath. Just sitting with your breath for just a few moments or so. So what I'd like you to do is to see if you can bring your awareness to something that is difficult for you in your life right now. Maybe it's an emotion from an event that happened in the past, something that was painful or distressing. Or maybe it's something in your life right now that's causing you painful feelings. Or maybe it's something you're worried about in the future. See if you can just allow yourself to bring your attention to some of these feelings and emotions. You might tune in to the situation just to feel the emotion itself. Maybe it's a number of emotions, and that's okay. And so just start by just labeling the different emotions that you just notice arising. Maybe it's just sadness or fear. Just label whatever emotions are there. And then see if there's one emotion that's the most predominant emotion for you. Maybe it's an emotion that threads its way through all of the other emotions. See if you can just label that emotion. Just label it very lightly to yourself. Fear, anxiety, sadness. Now put your attention in your body. Notice where in your body does this emotion reveal itself as a physical sensation? Where's the constriction? Where's the heat? Where's the tension? You may have to look through your entire body to see where this emotion is expressed as a physical sensation. Maybe it's in your face or your neck, or maybe it's just the tension in your shoulders or your stomach or your back or your hips or legs. Where in your body do you feel this emotion is a physical sensation? Now, keeping your attention on your body, see if you can start to relax the body around that emotion. See if you can unwind it. See if you can loosen the tension. Just relaxing the body around the emotion. Now, your tendency is to want to think about the emotion, but see what it's like to instead just keep your attention on the body and where in the body you would feel this emotion as a physical sensation. And then relaxing the body on each out breath. You might even soothe the body by saying some words to yourself like, "This is hard. This is really hard." Giving yourself the permission to feel the emotion just as it is. And then just simply allowing the emotion to be just as it is. You might say to yourself, "It's just like this. This fear is just like this. This anxiety is just like this." If you find yourself thinking about the emotion, again, see if you can let go of that. And instead, just keeping your attention on your body. The emotion is in your face. Let the muscles in your face unwind and loosen any tension that you have there. The emotion is in your muscles, in your neck and shoulders. Let your neck and shoulders unwind. Noticing the muscles in your arms and hands. Letting the muscles in your arms and hands unwind and loosen. Maybe the tension is in your chest. See if you can let the muscles in your chest unwind. Maybe the tension is in your back. Let the muscles in your back unwind and loosen any tension there. And then notice the muscles in your hips and legs. Let the muscles in your hips and legs unwind. Take your body as a whole. Take some time to experience just receiving, opening up to whatever is arising, the difficult emotion. And then deepening, just like dropping into a deep well. Now, if you find some place in your body that's very relaxed, put your attention there. Then using only your attention, just simply move your attention to another place on your body and bring the relaxation along. Just letting go of tensions, letting go of thinking, just relaxing and letting go. If while doing this you find your attention just wandered back to the breath, that's okay. That just means that the emotion has moved along. And so take a couple of deep breaths and then gently open your eyes. And so the practice I was giving you was called something called soften, soothe, and allow. And really what we're doing is we're just allowing the emotion to express itself as physical sensations in our body, which is where our emotions actually reside in our body. And then going through like the body relaxation and that I was taking you through, because it's when we do that, the emotion, remember, it's an emotion. The word key part of that is motion. It wants to move. It wants to move on. And so when we just relax our body, we allow the emotion to move on.
All right. I'm going to be focusing now for this little bit of brain talk really on the central importance of the mechanisms of brain engagement with body-centered circuits. So circuits of the brain that are always encoding what's going on in the body, which it turns out are highly related to our feelings, meaning emotional feelings, and our emotions. And so this practice that Alan led was a very kind of ideal type of practice to lead into this talk, in the sense that, first of all, it engages this network of the brain, this so-called salience network. The salience network is named that because whenever something salient happens for survival in the environment, this network of brain areas tends to light up. And it also is always lighting up in relationship to the feeling of the body. So the body, of course, is really of central importance for biological survival. And therefore, there's this overlap between what's biologically useful for attentional engagement and what is happening in the brain moment to moment as an index of what's happening in the body. And it turns out that a number of studies now have shown that engaging with mindfulness practices targets these areas, the areas of feeling tone. The technical word is insula, so you'll see it on some of these slides. And the degree of engaging, for example, with mindfulness practice in an 8-week course was found to be highly correlated, as you can see in these graphs on the right, with the degree to which the insula is more activated during mindfulness practice. So the more you practice, the more the insula tends to engage when you practice. In addition, there's this relationship between the activity of the insula and some of the other networks of the brain that seems to change as you engage with practice. So, for example, in that experiment I showed before of the effect of mindfulness practice on the brain's processing of adjectives that you can either process in a narrative way or an experiential way. In the novice group, what was found is there's this high correlation between the activation of the insula, the kind of tendency for that part of the brain, of the feeling tone of the body, to be communicating with the default mode that's kind of responsible for the narrative and our thinking process. Whereas after mindfulness training, you see not so much of an association with that, but instead more of an association between the cognitive control networks of the brain and the insula. So as you engage in practice, having this kind of enhanced capacity or tendency for those parts of the brain that are able to control what you're attending to be more in communication with the insula. This is just one of the many lines of insight showing the kind of impact of mindfulness training on the way in which the brain circuits tend to communicate with each other, as opposed to just an impact on the up or down of one particular circuit. So that's kind of the fuller picture that we now have. And as an example for the impact of this kind of training and impact on the insula and kind of real world intense experiences, I'll talk about the response to intense negative emotionally evocative sounds and images and pain. And in all cases, there's somewhat of a similar story. Here was with response to sounds, both sounds of all kind while people are in a scanner versus specifically negative sounds that are kind of distressing. And what was found is that meditators tend to show a decreased recruitment, both of the default mode network, this kind of narrative processing network, but also specifically of the amygdala, this other core part of the kind of emotional network of the brain. And so with longer term practice, it seems that the capacity for damping down the overexcitability of the amygdala is accomplished. And another finding with beginners going through practice, looking at the effect on a cognitive task that has these distracting, emotionally evocative images, like this snake image right here. They looked before and after a 6-week mindfulness class at the performance on this cognitive task and the impact of the emotional imagery, and found that, as I mentioned before, with this impact on attention, there was an increase in the performance, the attentional performance from before to after, comparing a control group that didn't do the mindfulness practice to a group that went through mindfulness practice. And in addition to that improvement in attentional performance, there was a greater engagement of the cognitive control network of the brain to kind of moderating the impact of those emotional images, and also this impact on the kind of feeling center of the brain, the insula. So there's an impact on increasing the activation of the insula, specifically to the negative imagery. And so it's not that one's brain becomes less responsive to noticing the feelings. It's that you actually become more responsive to noticing the feelings, but less distracted and reactive. One final line of evidence along those lines that uses emotional image processing, a group by Veronica Taylor in Canada, and they found comparing beginners to experienced meditators while viewing intense emotional imagery in a mindful state versus a baseline state, that the beginners showed this impact on the amygdala, this kind of decrease of the recruitment of the amygdala. And the experienced meditators didn't show that difference. So early on in practice, it seems you're kind of toning down the reactivity of this kind of emotional center of the brain. But with greater practice, what the longer term meditators showed was this reduced recruitment of the default mode, the kind of processes of the brain related to narrative and thinking. So while early on there's that tendency with practice to kind of tune out the emotional centered processing of the brain, later one is able to allow those emotional centers to be active, but just not lead to the reactive thinking and catastrophizing that tends to happen automatically with difficult emotional experience. And related to that also is the really prime example of pain. So looking at the impact of long-term open awareness type practice on the processing of painful stimuli versus in novices. This group led by Antoine Lutz published a really elegant set of findings showing that yes, to start with, meditators tend to have decreased unpleasantness ratings to the pain, and this has been replicated across many studies. Seems like meditation really has an impact on increasing one's resilience and capacity to not be bothered so much by painful stimuli. But in addition, there was an increase in the feeling-centered kind of network of the brain, the insula and anterior cingulate. And that increase in activation during the stimuli was also accompanied by, in the lead up to the stimulus, when the participants knew the stimulus was coming, there was a decrease. So normally in a novice's brain, there was an increase of that activity, that kind of pain network activity, even before the pain stimulus had come. As we kind of anticipate and expect, oh, this thing is going to come, it's going to bother me and be distressful. And in the long-term practitioner's brain, you see that anticipatory increase is not so present. And in addition, there's a much faster return down to baseline of the network of feeling tone as it's elicited by the painful stimulus. There's that slope. It goes down much more quickly in the experienced meditators as the brain becomes able to let go of the distressing experience. So in sum, when we look at the brain changes related to bodily awareness and the impact of these kinds of practices, we see, again, enhanced capacity for flexible brain engagements kind of common across all these different types of networks. And we see enhanced activation of the brain areas related to feeling and sensation in general. And as practice evolves, there's an enhanced control over the cognitive elaboration and the narrative processing, and a faster return to baseline. Overall, these indexes of the brain staying more present and in the moment. So I'm going to turn it back over to Alan.
Okay, so we're going to try a couple of different meditations again. And the first one I want to take you through is we're going to start with just a normal meditation, and then I'm going to open it up into what we might call flexible or open awareness meditation. So you can kind of experience what that is like. And so to do this, again, all we're going to do is find a comfortable posture. And then try to close your eyes and just, I think it's helpful to be curious about your mind and body, and then take a couple of breaths. And then we're going to start with our kind of awareness that we did in the very first meditation, where we have a meditation anchor like the breath. And so we'll start just by bringing your attention to the breath, wherever you receive the breath in your abdomen. your chest or your nose, just feeling the sensations of breathing, rising, falling, expansion. And just remember, this type of meditation is not a concentration meditation. Concentration meditation, anything that would take your attention away would be a distraction, but there are no distractions with mindfulness. So when your attention wanders off, you just simply notice that and escort your attention back to the breath. Even if your attention goes into a dark hole and you forget that you're even meditating, once you notice that's happened, you just go, oh, look, my attention really wandered away. And then escort your attention back to the breath. One breath ends and the next breath begins. Just keep returning every time you notice yourself lost in thought. Just let all the other objects, the thoughts and emotions and sensations, just stay in the background and just see if you can just pay attention to the breath or just returning to it whenever you get distracted. Now, when a new object, such as an emotion or a sensation, becomes very obvious, like it's calling out to you, you can let go of the breath and turn your attention to whatever this new object is. Feel the motion or sensation in your body. Just notice what happens to it as you pay attention to it. We'll stay with this new aspect of our experience until it no longer holds our attention or it stops. See if you can just notice the changing nature of the object that pulls you away. Now we're going to move to more open awareness. And to do that, just see if you can start to make your mind just as vast as the sky. Instead of focusing on the breath, don't focus on anything at all. Just remain calm and relaxed and yet fully aware. Let your mind be free from ideas, just clear and open. And without trying to actively block any perceptions or anything that comes through the senses, like recollections or imagination, just feel that you are simply uninfluenced by them, being like effortless and yet undistracted. And whenever a thought arises, just let them drift away like clouds in the sky. Sensations and sounds and thinking and emotions may be coming and going. Just notice these things that arise. Settle back and just notice whatever is obvious to you as it arises and passes. There's a sensation. It increases. A sound pulls you, then a memory. You feel your heart racing, and you take a breath. And there's a sensation in your foot, and so on. Emotion arises. A sound grabs you. These are just examples, but you can notice what pulls your attention. It might be very obvious, or it might be very subtle. Just follow what is most obvious in your experience. And your whole experience, it's almost like an orchestra. And then the thought just arises like a musician, does its thing, and then just sits down. An emotion arises, just like another musician. And then it sits down. And you just rest. Just rest in this open awareness of whatever is arising. Just remaining calm and relaxed, and yet fully aware. Free of ideas. Just clear and open. Then just take a couple of deep breaths, and then just gently open your eyes. All right. So that's an open awareness meditation. Some people, that's the way they meditate. So for some people, they find it a little bit disconcerting because they don't have an anchor or something that they can focus on. So it's not exactly something that's for everybody. But as I say, I've met a lot of people over the many years that I've been teaching and practicing that use this type of an approach because it's just opening up to whatever your experience is. Okay, so we're going to do one more meditation. In this meditation, I'm going to be focusing on your thinking. And so to do this, I need you to think. So unlike all the other meditations where we were just kind of like putting thoughts in the background, remember, mindfulness isn't trying to push these things away. It's just allowing them to be as they are. But in this time, during the meditation, I'll ask you to actually focus on your thinking. And so for that, again, we're just going to close our eyes and do this last meditation, starting with mindfulness of the breath. So it's just like you're on an ocean, in a small raft with an anchor into the earth. And the anchor is your breath. And along comes these waves of thinking and emotions and body sensations. And these are the things that just arise. And if you just notice these things when they arise, just like waves on the ocean, everything that arises like this will pass away. And you'll stay anchored to the breath. But every once in a while, a really big wave comes along. And it makes it really hard to stay on the breath. And when that happens with mindfulness, we actually just turn our attention to the thinking and make that the object of our meditation. So for this, I'd like you to start maybe thinking of something. Maybe it's something that's going on in your life right now. Or maybe it's thoughts of an event that was in the past. Or maybe you're thinking about things going on in the present time. Maybe it's planning, lots of planning going on. Maybe something that you're worried about in the future. Just allow yourself to bring your attention to focus on one or few of these worrying thoughts. So here, instead of having our attention on the breath, we're just going to put our attention on the fact that we're thinking. I see you thinking. Now notice what is happening in your body right now as you have these thoughts. Are there places or tension or tightness? Oftentimes we find tension and tightness that's actually supporting our difficult thinking. What's happening to your breathing? Is your breathing shorter because you're doing this thinking? What's going on there? See if you can notice the sensations in your body, tension, tightness, how your breath has changed. And then notice the thoughts that are going through your mind. Just notice them as thoughts. Just reminding yourself that thoughts are not facts. They're simply what your mind is saying or creating at any given moment. They may be based on factual events, but they're simply the mind thinking. These are the thoughts that just arise. Notice them as they change. And notice each new thought as it replaces the previous one. As you continue to notice the sensations in your body, see if you can put words to some of the feelings that come with these difficult and painful thoughts. They may be feelings like sadness or hurt or anger or loneliness, fear or pain. Feelings may be difficult and even uncomfortable, but they're not right or wrong. They're simply part of your present moment experience. So allow your awareness to move between the thoughts you're having as you notice them, the physical sensations you're having as you notice them, and the feelings and emotions you're having as you notice them. So we're just noticing that there's thoughts, emotions, and body sensations, and they're all connected. Move between the thinking you're having, the physical sensations you're having as you notice them, and the feelings and emotions you're having as you notice them. And then finally bring your awareness and attention back to your breathing for a while. Just noticing the physical sensation of taking breath into your body and releasing it. And then sometimes when we have really difficult thinking, it's really an emotion that's like the thought factory. And so put your attention on the emotion and make that the object of the meditation. So for the last minute of this meditation, again, just see what it's like to just notice whatever is arising and see if you can just accept it. Relax the mind. You don't have to react to it or judge it or do anything at all with it. It's just what arises. And whatever arises will pass away. And then just take a couple of deep breaths. And then just gently open your eyes.
Thank you once again, Alan.
Sure.
I'm happy to say that it looks like we're going to be able to finish up at least a few minutes ahead of time. Mean that we have some time for some question and answers at the end as well. So we had here a great introduction to practice more along the spectrum of open awareness, not trying to limit the focus of attention to the breath or to the body, but really allowing and accepting everything into awareness while maintaining attempt to really cultivate that capacity for a kind of open spaciousness, clinging on, resting out, but to right path here, non-reactive, spacious awareness. And one of the things that that kind of practice really points to is the impact of practice on the default mode network, this network that I've mentioned now repetitively regarding its role in the narrative process. Of course, narrative processes are so important and central to our existence as human beings. The capacity to formulate meaning and engage in planning and reminiscing, all is related to this narrative processing and these kind of higher order networks of the brain. And it's also very related to our tendency towards living in a kind of self-constructed, polluted world, and a world where when we do end up finding ourselves in suffering, oftentimes these networks are just overactive and not at all under our control. They were at first identified using fMRI by noticing those parts of the brain that were more active across all the many tasks that were being looked at in the scanner. They were more active when you told people to stop doing the task. So it became known as the default mode. It's what the brain tended to do when you don't tell somebody to do something specific. And it turns out that the default mode network is fluctuating. Its activity is fluctuating all the time in a manner that's kind of anti-correlated with some of the other networks, the kind of attentional engagement networks that are responsible to kind of engage with the environment, or the salient network that I mentioned that's related to the ongoing feeling of the body and the kind of relevance of environmental stimuli to survival. So this kind of back and forth fluctuating, anti-correlating activity of the default mode network is one of the things we now really know about it. And this is one of the early demonstrations by Judd Brewer and colleagues, showing that that default mode network activation really seems to be specifically related to meditation practice. So long-term meditators compared to novices when meditating compared to having no meditation instruction, they showed that capacity to really ramp down the activation of the default. And a related finding was shown by Giuseppe Pagnoni in Italy, showing that long-term Zen practitioners, when shown words in an fMRI scanner, somewhat like that experiential versus narrative processing experiment that I mentioned before, this experiment gave the meditators, compared to the novices or controls, the instruction to just press a button as to whether the word is meaningful or not, if it's a scrambled group of letters or a meaningful word. So people did have to attend to what was on the screen, but to refrain from engaging in thought about the word. And what they found was this kind of faster return down to baseline of default mode network in meditators. So that capacity, not just for the network to kind of calm down and reduce its activity when meditating in expert practitioners, but also even when given stimuli that require some engagement with thought, that capacity to kind of allow that network to go back to silence as related to long-term practitioners. And this despite the fact that the meditators actually were faster in their reaction time, categorizing whether the stimuli were real words or not. And then an interesting set of findings related to the anti-correlation, the engagement of this default mode network as it relates to the other networks of the brain, the so-called task positive, those networks that tasks tend to engage, networks of the brain. A few studies have now shown that the degree to which those two networks are anti-correlated with each other may be really targeted by mindfulness practice, in particular the kind of more dramatically open awareness type of mindfulness practice. So Dahl and colleagues showed this relationship that in novices, those who scored higher in mindfulness tended to show less of that dramatic anti-correlation, comparing the default mode with the other networks of the brain. They were not so dramatically anti-correlated with each other. They tended to fire a little bit more together instead of being so segregated from each other. Similarly, Judd Brewer and colleagues in their finding, where they showed that impact of meditation on decreasing the default mode activation, also showed that those people who had more expertise, longer term engagement with practice, didn't show so much of the anti-correlation between the types of networks and the default mode. And lastly, this study looking at long-term practitioners of a Tibetan Buddhist form of practice referred to as non-dual awareness, that relaxing away of the distinction between the observed contents of the mind and the observer, so that what's experienced moment to moment is just experience itself, and you're no longer kind of observing it as an observer, but instead there's this subject-object dichotomy that melts away completely. And of course, that can happen to anybody engaging in meditation or not. And these are kind of special moments, sometimes kind of referred to as mystical experiences. But folks who have really cultivated that capacity in their meditative practice tended to show a really dramatic effect on that segregation of the default mode network from the networks, in this case, the kind of visual attention networks of the brain that were activated by showing a movie. And so what they showed was on the right there, the focused attention had a greater correlation between, the focused attention showed a greater anti-correlation. So the default mode network and the attention networks being very differently firing from each other, those negative scores on the figure in the lower right. Whereas in the non-dual awareness, where that sense of the distinction or boundary between self and world, or observer and observed, dissipates away, those networks start firing a little bit more in concert with each other, not so segregated from each other. And somewhat similar to that, some folks in Israel, Dora Zierman and Aviva Berkovich-Ohana and colleagues have done a series of studies with long-term experts who have that capacity through their many years of practice to experience that narrative self, the sense of self as identified with our thinking process and the kind of story of our life. You know, during practice, there's that capacity to let go of that identification and just be experiencing the moment, a kind of momentary or minimal self, that there's just moment-to-moment experience. And then through engaging in that those kinds of practices even more intensively over time, one experiences this kind of selflessness, that there's no longer a self that's experiencing, there's just experience. And so looking at what kind of changes in brain activity were associated with that transition, where people self-reported, okay, I was experiencing a narrative self, I was experiencing a momentary kind of minimal self, to a selfless experience, they showed that activity in the default mode was decreased in this high frequency activity of the brain, the gamma frequencies. And a recent experiment that I'm just getting done writing up for publication myself looked at this kind of key aspect of how the self-representation in the brain has changed through long-term practice. And here I used a paradigm called the self-name paradigm, which turns out if you expose somebody to hearing their own name versus another name that's not the self-name, the brain tends to respond very robustly to the self-name because it becomes so kind of identified with the self-name and the narrative self. And in fact, it's even been shown over many years of experiments looking at states of the vegetative state, or during sleep, deep sleep, or REM sleep, that this preservation of the brain's preferential activation to the self-name is seen, even when one is not consciously aware and awake. So using this kind of paradigm, what I found was that long-term meditators did not show that preferential response to the self-name. You can see on these scalp maps of the response of the brain to the stimuli, there's a big red response in the controls to self compared to the other name, whereas the meditator showed minimal difference comparing the self to the other, and this is just the amplitude of that difference that's quite different for the controls, but identical in meditators across 3 different groups. And it turns out that that effect, that tendency of the brain to respond less robustly to the self as if it's the most important thing in the world, was related to some important measures of clinical significance, related to well-being, the degree to which that activity was engaged, was anti-correlated with mindfulness. So those people had the biggest response would tend to be less mindful, and also they tended to have more negative emotion, wired. So I'm going to set aside, that's the kind of end of the activation of the default mode and this kind of narrative processing as related to meditative practice. And just a last couple of slides showing these kind of summary findings by Eileen Luders and colleagues, kind of signifying maybe the real significance for healthy aging and well-being of these kinds of practices, that long-term structural brain changes seem to be very evident when comparing meditators to non-meditators. The preservation of really central, important brain areas like the hippocampus is so important for our memory capacity, and shown very robustly preserved relative to the aging process in meditators. Similarly, the integrity and structural kind of intactness of the corpus callosum that allows for the communication left in the right brain. And here's a kind of overview of their findings, the different gray areas. negative correlation found in meditation practice for a lifetime, these age-related thinning. So in summary, looking at this area of investigation related to the brain effect of meditation as related to decreased identification thinking, this enhanced capacity for flexible brain engagement is again seen, as is the altered configuration of the default network and the change in the degree to which it's segregated in its activation from other networks. As practice evolves, we know from self-reports over really thousands of years of engaging in these kinds of contemplative practices, there's a shift in the experience of the self and the sense of identification with the narrative sense of self. And that transforming sense of self tends to really relate to changing the experience of suffering. And then we see these complementary benefits on the preservation of the brain with aging. We don't know it's really related to those functional findings or not. So I want to just end there and open up at least for a couple of minutes.
Rael, we have one question. What happens in the brain when non-dual awareness is present?
Well, you know, that one slide I showed is probably the best evidence we have, and we do have it in studies looking at other ways of experiencing non-dual awareness as well, but that both the decrease of the activation of the default mode network as well as the decrease in the segregation of the activation of the default mode with some of the other networks, that it seems as though the functional segregation of these parts of the brain kind of tending to fire in relative isolation from each other,
Right.
as that experience of kind of experiencing a decrease in the boundary between inner and outer goes away. We also see that the brain starts kind of firing in more synergistic ways.
All right. Well, it's 5 seconds to 2:50. So thank you all for your participation in this. And if you have any questions about mindfulness, you can reach me at mindful@usc.edu. And thank you so much for joining us.